You're listening to A Second Look on The Orca. A Second Look is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on past events, unpack their significance, and discuss their long-term implications. A Second Look is intended to give thoughtful reflection on issues that made the headlines and elicited strong responses as a society. What did we think then? What do we think now? What have we learned? And now, your host, Justin Goodrich.
Welcome to this month's edition of A Second Look here on The Orca. I'm your host, Justin Goodrich. Unlike previous months, which have focused on specific events, this month's episode takes a second look at a trend that has seen the law enforcement community going from being the good guys to the bad guys. Joining me today is Calvin Chrustie, Managing Director at CC Resolve. A law enforcement veteran, Calvin's background includes complex international investigations, hostage negotiations, kidnap-for-ransom, intelligence, conflict management, and other high-risk operations. Welcome to the program, Calvin.
Thanks very much for having me, Justin.
As a law enforcement veteran, when you look back at the past 30 or so years, what's changed when it comes to the relationship between police and the public?
Obviously, social media has played a significant role and influence in that relationship. And in particular, I would say global social media, international social media has influenced the perceptions, attitudes of the public. And then also globalization has brought new problems and new challenges to policing that has also probably amplified and made some additional challenges from a policing side in terms of meeting their mandates and protecting society because of globalization. So I think globalization in both ways, in terms of attitudes towards the police, coupled with challenges the police have to face, probably combine and have created some, unprecedented challenges in terms of the policing profession.
So, speaking to that first point, then, in terms of just perception as a whole, vis-a-vis social media, which allows anyone and everyone to offer an opinion, informed or otherwise. Tell me a little bit about how you believe that piece specifically has impacted the law enforcement community.
Well, I would say that, policing communities and policing organizations around the world have a spectrum of professionalism. Some of the challenges they have are very unique and different based on communities, whether it's a community in the Middle East or a community in Africa or a community in Europe versus a community in North America, and even distinct from a community in the US to a Canadian community. The challenges are unique and also, the nature, the level of professionalism of police organizations, the level of training that they get is very different. So I would say that there's not a holistic aspect of policing. There's a lot of diversity within policing in terms of capacity and training and approaches to it. And I think through social media, a lot of the various concerns and issues that take place nationally and internationally are now shared. And sometimes because of the uniform that we all wear, that there's a transference of some issues from one society to another ones that, say, for example, in the Canadian context, get transferred into our society. And some of them have legitimacy and some, to be frank and blunt, I don't think are applicable to Canadian society.
Can you give me perhaps an example of that, or maybe just extrapolate that a little bit? Certainly, what you mentioned in terms of even the delineation between policing in the United States compared to Canada, perhaps through the lens of training or otherwise.
Well, I would say the Canadian police are fortunate in terms of the length of training, the selection process, um, and I would say just from a historical, cultural perspective, well, not having a perfect track record, I think the policing standards in Canada are significantly different than the U.S. On the flip side of the coin, in a spirit of being humble, they also have some extremely unique challenges in terms of crime issues, in terms of access to weapons, um, and the general societal kind of conditions are different there than they are here. Thus, in this particular case, in terms of the topic today, a lot of the social media that's influencing, say, the perceptions of Canadians has an origin, coming from the U.S. And I think, we're both aware of some of the incidents over the last several years that have those images, the communication, in the news, in the media relative to them has obviously cascaded over the border into Canadian society, and sometimes has blurred the unique differences, I think, between societies, between Canada and the U.S., and some of the unique differences in terms of policing styles and approaches, as well as some of the unique challenges in terms of violence and officer safety and community safety. And to say that they're similar, I think would be a oversimplification. I think there's a lot of unique differences and complexities that are different. However, the social media appears to portray them as being very similar when I think they're very different.
No, and I think that's certainly fair commentary. The other element that you addressed in terms of the changing nature of policing over 30 years and the relationship between police and the public beyond social media, you also touched on this idea of globalization. Maybe unpack that a little bit for my listeners.
Well, I think particularly police in Canada have been hit hard in terms of from the implications of globalization. I think there's a lot of discussion out there right now in terms of transnational organized crime, national security issues that have cascaded into the Canadian context of policing, and a policing system that was generally designed to be most effective, I would suggest, to rural policing, some municipal policing, but the structures are probably not the most effective to deal with these others. And I think you're seeing it currently here in the last couple of weeks, where the organized crime activities and transnational organized crime activities cascade down into gang violence in the Vancouver area, and really it seems for the last 15 years or 20 years it's continued, and it's always been a challenge, and it hasn't been a challenge, or will continue to be a challenge, I think, until some of the structures change, where we have, say, an FBI, a DEA, a Homeland Security, an ATF, and have a strong federal component to look at the strategic threats. And we have a three-tiered level of policing, like we have a three-tiered level of government. But right now, I wouldn't suggest that our structures really allow for a effective three-tiered policing. So you're seeing that cascade down in terms of problems and issues within the municipal and the provincial level, in terms of organized crime activities. And that's what I'm talking about, the globalization impact on it. And then you add all the other stuff from cyber to money laundering, and a lot of the other contemporary topics that we're hearing about.
Well, Calvin, I mean, for me, I find this fascinating. As you know, and as I think my listeners know, my background is in international criminal law. So my scholarship deals with some of these issues, and I find these things fascinating. But what I've come to realize, and it's so appropriate that you mention it, is this sort of, if you will, a trickle down effect in terms of the things that are happening globally, but how they actually play themselves out on our streets through gang violence or in our casinos through money laundering. And I don't know that your average citizen necessarily has an appreciation for the correlation between what's happening internationally and how it impacts us domestically and locally. I also find your comments about the tiered policing in Canada very, very interesting, and it's something that's often crossed my mind, that the need for a reorganization of the RCMP or otherwise as a federal agency, and delineating between them and provincial and municipal forces could be hugely advantageous to address these very issues. So you and I are definitely like-minded in terms of what we think would be beneficial. I want to take it now down to sort of the day-to-day patrol work type conversation. One of the things that we're hearing a lot about is this idea that police are being asked to do so many different things, to be not just a police officer, but be, a de facto social worker, addictions counselor, a teacher, youth worker, all these different things. And the argument that people are making is police shouldn't be doing all those things. What's interesting is that police are saying, well, we don't want to be doing those things. We want to be engaged in policing. Walk listeners through a little bit about how the role of police officers has changed through that lens, and what needs to happen to try and get back to policing being a core service, while also recognizing that maybe there's a place for others at the table to address some of these other challenges.
Well, I will, but I'm going to drag my heels a little bit on the last part of the conversation, because I think it's difficult to separate, globalization and those issues and the new challenges that all that brings to how that impacts the person on the street. Because if I recall back in my days in Burnaby, going back 15 years ago, when I was overseeing the investigative units in Burnaby, we were struggling then in terms of what's a threshold for a fraud complaint, for us to investigate and put resources into a fraud complaint. And back then, we were looking at whether it was 100,000 or should it be 400,000 or should it be 500,000. But when I first started policing, probably if it was 1,000 or 2,000, we were engaged in investigating. I can't even imagine where it is currently. And a lot of that has to deal with the complexity of it. Those issues of cybercrime, affect municipal police departments just as much, it's a new phenomena, and the training and the capacity, the organized crime activities, the gang violence, all that stuff cascades in it. And then it becomes, okay, what about, as you alluded to, that other area in terms of the patrol and the response? But those two actually clash within the organization. And the uniformed person, I'm sure, is still getting response. I think I just went to, in my current role as a consultant, to deal with the police in a particular situation. But I had to go through, the front counter. I had to go through a patrol officer. And we were having conversations that would, in terms of for lack of a better term, a very high level international concerning incident that I had to have a conversation with. Well, 30 some years ago, I would have never got exposed to something like that. And now I'm having conversations with a patrol officer about the complexities of somebody that wanted to come forward with a threat. So I don't want to pretend those don't have an impact on them. So they do have an impact. And then added on top of that, the impact and the pressures put on the police for having a legal framework that's probably about 20 or 30 years outdated and hasn't kept pace with the changes that have taken place in society, to give them the tools and the capabilities to do what they need to do. That's put extra pressure on police. And I'll just use an example of two court cases, Stinchcombe and Jordan, which from a policing perspective, once they charge somebody, the pressures that are on the investigators to, and that's inclusive of a patrol officer, to produce disclosure packages for court in terms of notes, documentations, record or documentation evidence, and all the other evidence there, and then putting a timeline in terms of it through the Jordan decision. That again puts offers pressure, and that pressure does trickle into the patrol officer, because if it was the plainclothes officers that are doing that stuff, they only have so much capacity. So they're saying, and what I saw was the plainclothes units that are there to support the patrol officers, they don't have the capacity anymore because of the legal framework to support the patrol officers like they did 30 years ago, where if a complaint came in to go, hey, we'll take that sexual assault, we'll take that fraud, we'll take this, their capacity, because of all this other stuff that I referred to in terms of the legal framework, in terms of globalization and organized crime, and the national security stuff, the cyber stuff, the patrol officers really out on their own to a greater degree. And when you look at police budgets, public support, court processes, none of that's been, aligned to assist and support the needs of the police. Be quite honest, it's been neglected by politicians and our political leaders, as if it didn't, as if these things haven't existed. And the conversations and regarding the issues and challenges around Stinchcombe and the laws have been discussed for the last 20 years, but there hasn't been any changes or any modifications to it.
Well, Calvin, you bring up so many truly fascinating points. I think the first thing that comes to mind, or the most prominent thing that comes to mind, certainly is this idea of the laws not keeping up to date, and the manner in which that ties the hands of policing. And I often think to myself, I'm empathetic towards the police, because I think, and I say this as a civilian, but as someone who has close links to the law enforcement community in different ways, I feel for the average police officer, because I think they're required to engage in situations and deal with issues that are not of their own doing, but they're simply stuck within this framework that they have to operate within. And to your point, it would take some profound political leadership to really change the landscape. So I'm empathetic to your average patrol officer that walks around dealing with one arm tied behind their back, it seems.
I couldn't agree more, Justin, with you. I started off 35 years ago. I have a stepchild who 20 years ago, I would have loved to see them and other people get into the policing career. But as it stands right now, myself and many of my associates are hesitant, to advise our kids to get into it, because it's almost going into a situation of a no-win situation currently, because the lack of support for policing in terms of political support, but beyond that, in terms of legal support. Hey, here's the problem. Go into the boxing ring, but you're going to go into this fight, and we're going to tie, your ankles together and one hand behind your back, and just go do your best. And that's all we look for. But what happens? They get beat up in the process, and they're being asked and tasked to do things that the community, I would suggest, and the politicians haven't given them the support to do. And I would say, I don't want to make it a us them conversation, but I do think there's, even at the police leadership within the police organizations, perhaps there's an over focus and a bit of an obsession to maintain the next contract or maintain the extension of their leadership tenure because of the significant pay opportunities. And they're focused on longevity versus quality of leadership. And as we've talked before in the past about, I think that's a problem where you get leaders that want to stay leaders when really in this type of environment in police leadership, I don't see how one can endure. I watch leaders currently in the police forces where they're seeing their organizations struggling. And for sure, some of it is within the police organizations itself, but some of it's perhaps a lack of support from the political system or the legal system or whatever. But you don't see them speak out, right? True leaders are there to support, the people they're working for. And you see that with some people, but I think it's rarer than it is more common in terms of police leadership, at least within the Canadian context.
Well, Calvin, being an outsider, I can't necessarily speak intelligently to everything that you've just said. You bring a unique vantage point to this conversation. But as an academic who teaches public policy and organizational leadership at the graduate level, I can certainly concur that a good leader has a shelf life, and they're aware of that shelf life. And they understand that exceeding that shelf life could have a detrimental impact on their organization. What I like to do is take the conversation to this notion then of something you said much earlier, which is about you wouldn't, people in your peer group, your friends, your colleagues, struggling with the idea of suggesting to your stepchild or other young aspiring young people to even consider policing, given the landscape of policing today. And I've got friends on the job 10, 15 years or more on the job, and they are watching their peers just exit policing altogether. The intention was go have a 25, 30-year career, and then collect your pension, and that's that. But even some of my friends, have moments are like, man, this is just not what I signed up for. So where I'm going with this, Calvin, is we're starting to see some attrition from sort of mid-career police officers. And it concerns me deeply in terms of, well, who will the next generation of police leaders be? If we're losing some really good people, again, 15 years on the job, detective sergeants, staff sergeants, and they're going, this just isn't what I signed up for. What does that mean for the future of good policing and good leadership in policing? Are we on the verge of a bit of a crisis here? Are we at a tipping point, Calvin?
I think so. I think in the last couple of years, some of the best people in policing I know have left. If they haven't left, they're contemplating leaving. If they have an opportunity, I'd say they may leave. I've always found the ones that are bothered by this the most, the ones that care the most, they're the ones that the community should really be valuing in terms of what they bring to the table, because they bring passion. They're there really to protect Canadians. They really believe in it. But it's also the ones, coincidentally, that are impacted negatively by the current kind of narrative that's out in society right now, that I would say is extremely divisive. I think it's unfair for the vast majority of police. And I don't think it does anything in terms of constructively make Canada a better community. It doesn't help integrate our communities, and it creates the the risk of the us them dynamic even getting further apart rather than closer. And I think the whole issues attached to police in the school is an example of that. I appreciate if you watch the news and you look at a few incidents and incidents in the U.S. How you could ask yourself, hey, should the police be possibly in the schools? But if you go beyond social media and the news, and you see exactly what that interaction looks like in the schools, where the police officers are playing sports, where the police officers are there if a child has an issue, that took place the night before and doesn't know where to talk to because he has absent parents in the relationship. And I coach 14 and 15-year-old boys soccer. When I coach, before COVID, maybe 20% of the parents show up. Where's the rest of the parents? There's a lot of kids out there that don't have engaging parents. And the police, I think, in the role in terms of a police liaison officer in school, sometimes there is for that kid to have a conversation with. If, say, there was possibly talk of a fight going to take place at school where knives are going to be used, or if there's going to be somebody talking about a gun incident or whatever else, I just don't think removing them from the schools is good. At least talking to the people I've talked to, and I'm talking to not just police officers but other parents in the vast majority. But sadly, they're the silent majority and the vocal minority, with perhaps some legitimate bad experiences in themselves, or perhaps from exposure to social media have formed opinions, but I'm not sure if those opinions are accurate and reflective as to the realities in terms of what was taking place in schools in Vancouver or New West or other communities where these issues have surfaced.
Well, two things come to mind here ever so briefly, Calvin. The first one is a comment you made earlier about, the manner in which sort of the societal discourse is having, a negative impact on police officers who were once very passionate about their jobs, and are now again asking that question. Why am I here? This is not what I signed up for. Why am I still doing this? And you're so spot on when you say the police officers that are most impacted by this are the really fundamentally good human beings, the ones, the men and women who put on the uniform because they want to make a difference. They want to make the community better. And none of that said tritely or in a cliche manner, but they really believe in what they do. And yet it's sort of this no-win situation that becomes so disheartening for them that when they go home at the end of the day, they're just so incredibly exhausted and just in some instances just sad. And it's so heartbreaking. I want to turn now to what you just said about schools, because it was on my list of things I wanted to chat with you about. And if you'll indulge me for a second, Calvin, I want to tell you a quick story. I was in high school. I was a good kid, a bit of a nerd, probably a little bit cocky as well, but all around good kid, didn't do drugs, didn't smoke, didn't do, any of those things. But I was still going through a really rough time. And the person in my life that really had a profound impact on me was my school liaison officer. His name was Constable Jim Poulin. I went to Delta Secondary School in Ladner. I graduated in 1999. And as recently as, I kid you not, as recently as 2 weeks ago, I was talking to Jim. Here we are, 20 years later. And this man was my school liaison officer. He was my mentor. He was the person that invested in me. And I recognize that not all young people have good experiences with the police, for sure. But when I look at the net positive impact of police in schools, based on everything that you've just articulated, right? It's playing sports, it's building relationships, it's being a safe person that a young person can come to and say, hey, I'm struggling with this, or I heard that, or whatever the case might be. The net positive benefit of police in schools is just astronomical. And the fact that there's this political movement to get police out of schools just boggles my mind. And here's my question attached to all of that, Calvin. With this narrative that police are no longer the good guys, whether it's taking police out of schools, not allowing them to participate in uniform in the annual Pride Parade in Vancouver, those types of things, what kind of message do you think that sends to children?
Well, I know what type of message it sends because fortunately I have a child, a stepchild, that's 14, 15, and I have a whole bunch of kids that I coach soccer with. I, I, the message it sends, I mean, I would say those that know, say, for example, like the ones I deal with, that actually interact with police or former police like myself, and there's other police that come out and coach soccer with me. I think they're confused because what they're seeing from some political elements, where here we are, not in our police uniforms, but they know we're all former police or police, and at 7 or 8 o'clock at night, we're on the soccer field teaching them soccer drills. I'm not seeing the narrative of those others with the other narrative on the fields with the kids at night. So I think the kids are kind of going, well, hold on, these guys are having a ton of fun. They're here for us. When they've had a bad game or a bad practice, we're pumping them up. We're trying to build them, and we're trying to teach them, leadership skills, interpersonal skills, team skills. So I think there's a confusion amongst them because they go back into schools and they hear about all this other stuff, and it's incongruent with their own life experiences. So there's a group of kids like that. Then there's the other group of kids that perhaps have very little interaction now with police, and I don't think they're going to have the opportunity to be influenced like them. I hear the narrative, from the Board of Education or the school boards. We'll call when the police required. Well, let me say this. It's usually too late by that time. Something's already happened, and the prevention part you've just removed from the element of it, and now it's in a reaction part. And that's usually never a good type of interaction. And just like yourself, Justin, I'll just tell you a story about myself. Never thought of it before this interview, but your story triggered it. I was a policeman, and I was policing at one point in time in my career in Yugoslavia during the height of the war, and it was just a horrible situation. And just, I mean, I can't explain it, but let's just say I was there with the United Nations in the role as a policeman. And I remember getting a letter one time when I was at the height of the war, when I was posted in Sarajevo, and it was like regular shellings and bombings and machine guns, like 24 hours around the clock. And I remember getting a letter, and it was from 2 school kids that I went to school with back in my hometown in Winnipeg. And they were both writing me from prison. They were both in the same prison at the time. And they were telling me they were sitting there writing this letter as they were peeling potatoes and passing the letter back and forth to add paragraphs to it. And both of them were doing prison time for drug trafficking and other criminal activity. And they were my best friends, when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. And I reflected, what was the difference between them being in prison and me trying to help others, in terms of being a peacekeeper and helping others in society and having this other, what I would say, fantastic life. It probably wasn't school liaison, but it was a police mentor that I had, because we grew up in the same environment. And my It was actually my cousin's husband who, periodically I used to go fishing with, hang out with periodically at family functions. And he was the guy that inspired me. And when I talked to, my spouse says the same thing. She grew up in a school where there was good guys and bad guys. But the defining part was that police officer in the school. So I think for those kids that don't have it, I don't even think they're going to know. They're going to come across a fork in the road, and instead of going right, they're going to go wrong. And I think it's going to be silent, and they're not even going to know about it. And that's going to be the sad losses, I think, based on my personal experience and experience of other police officers.
Calvin, I think in a lot of ways that's the right note to conclude our interview on. This notion that if the police aren't at the table and they're not a part of the community and they're not engaged, the net negative impact of that, up to and including young people choosing, to go down the not so good path, is very problematic. And I appreciate you highlighting all of these elements today. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Calvin.
Thanks very much, Justin. I'd just like to thank those listeners that you have, for supporting the police, those that support the police, and really encourage them to continue on, because I know police officers are usually fairly silent on these issues due to their professional obligations. But I know those that do speak up are extremely appreciated.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this month's edition of A Second Look here on the Orca. I'd like to thank my guest, Calvin Chrustie of CC Resolve, for joining me. By way of a final comment, please remember what your parents taught you growing up. You should never let a few rotten apples spoil the bunch. So the next time you see a police officer, consider thanking them for their service, remembering that they too are husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, and of course, they are the ones who go running towards the danger when most of us tend to head the other direction. Until next time, I'm Justin Goodrich. Thanks for listening.
The preceding program was brought to you by Alliance Public Affairs Group in association with Van Grio. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, please email us at asecondlook@theorca.ca. Thank you for listening, and please remember to like and share.